Picture a Saturday in late May 1975. The kind of day that feels like a collective reward for surviving a long, damp British winter. Across the United Kingdom, from the rugged highlands of Scotland to the manicured gardens of the south coast, the sun wasn't just shining. No jung ngu tree. Temperatures had soared to a blissful 25 degrees Celsius. In thousands of back gardens, the air was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass and the charcoal smoke of the season's first barbecues. Men were in shorts, ladies in sundresses, and children were splashing in paddling pools, absolutely certain that the great British summer had finally arrived, with an ironclad guarantee. This wasn't just a warm spell, it felt like a new era. In fact, parts of Scotland had just recorded their sunniest May in history, with the island of Tiree logging over 300 hours of pure, uninterrupted sunshine. The nation was basking in a golden glow, talking of droughts and hosepipe bans, never imagining that a meteorological ambush was already closing in. At the Park cricket ground in Buxton, Derbyshire, the scene was the very definition of English tranquility. Derbyshire was taking on Lancashire in a high-stakes match, and the atmosphere was electric. The legendary Clive Lloyd was at the crease, and he was putting on a masterclass of power hitting. The ball wasn't just being struck, it was being launched, disappearing over the boundaries and into the neighbouring bowling green with a regularity that had spectators shielding their eyes from the glare. People sat on the grass, shirt sleeves rolled up, ice creams melting in their hands, soaking in the brilliance of a June-like Saturday in May. By the time the stumps were drawn, over 370 runs had been scored. The crowd headed home with sunburnt shoulders and happy hearts, already making plans to return on Monday for more of the same. Nobody was checking the weather forecast. Why would they? The sky was a deep, unblemished azure, and the heat felt permanent. But as the sun dipped below the horizon on Sunday evening, the atmosphere began to shift in a way that defied every instinct of the season. High above the North Sea, a powerful low-pressure system was tracking southwards with predatory intent. It wasn't pulling in warm, balmy air from the Mediterranean or the Azores. Instead, it was acting as a giant atmospheric vacuum, dragging a tongue of lethal Arctic air straight down from the frozen reaches of Scandinavia and the North Pole. This was air that belonged in the dead of January, a freezing polar blast that was about to collide head-on with a nation dressed in cotton and linen. As Britain went to bed on Sunday night, dreaming of another day in the sun, the mercury was already beginning its terrifying vertical plunge. The golden illusion of summer was about to be shattered by a frost so rare it would only be seen once in 250 years. As the clock struck midnight on Sunday, June 1st, 1975, a silent, invisible predator was descending upon the British Isles. The transition was so abrupt, so violent, that it felt less like a change in weather and more like a tear in the fabric of the seasons. The balmy, lavender-scented air of Saturday evening was being systematically scoured away by a northerly gale that screamed across the North Sea. This wasn't just a cold front, it was a total atmospheric replacement. The mercury in thermometers across the country began a vertical plunge that defied all logic of the calendar. In less than 48 hours, Britain would fall from a peak of 25 degrees to a bone-shattering 2 degrees. It was as if the country had been physically transported from the Mediterranean to the Arctic Circle, while its citizens slept. By the first grey light of Monday morning, the shock was total. People who had laid out their shorts and linen shirts the night before woke to a world that looked through the window like the depths of January. The radiators, which had been switched off and forgotten for weeks, were stone cold. In the Highlands of Scotland, the temperature plummeted to -3.3 degrees at Gleneagles. At Balmoral, the mercury hit a staggering -5 degrees on the ground. This wasn't a light morning frost. It was a deep, crystalline freeze that gripped the burgeoning life of June in a lethal embrace. The daffodils and tulips, which had been basking in the sun just 36 hours earlier, were now encased in ice, their vibrant colours muted by a layer of white frost that felt like a cruel joke. The meteorology behind this event was a freak occurrence, a 250-year event, according to the experts. A high-pressure system near Greenland and a deep low over Scandinavia had combined to create a polar chimney, a direct corridor that funneled Arctic air straight into the heart of the UK. By 8 a.m, the rain that began to fall across the Midlands and the north wasn't liquid for long. Within minutes, it turned into stinging hail and then, impossibly, into thick, wet, heavy flakes of snow. Real snow. The kind of snow that stops traffic and cancels school. Drivers heading to work in light summer jackets watched in disbelief as their windscreens became encrusted with ice. They looked at their calendars, then at the sky, and wondered if the world had somehow tilted off its axis. Summer had not just vanished, it had been executed. If there is one sport that embodies the quintessential English summer, it is cricket. It is a game played under the soft, golden light of long afternoons, accompanied by the gentle clink of teacups and the rhythmic thud of leather on willow. But on Monday, June the 2nd, 1975, at the Park Ground in Buxton, cricket became a stage for the surreal. The players from Derbyshire and Lancashire, who just 48 hours earlier had been battling under a scorching sun, arrived at the pavilion to find a sky the colour of dirty pewter. The air was no longer a warm caress. It was a blade. By mid-morning, the impossible happened. A heavy, relentless curtain of white began to fall from the heavens, transforming the lush green outfield into a desolate Arctic wasteland in less than 30 minutes. Umpire Dickie Bird, a man who had seen almost every eccentricity the weather could throw at a cricket pitch, stepped out to inspect the conditions. He was met with a sight that defied half a century of experience. The snow wasn't just dusting the grass, it was accumulating with a terrifying speed. As he walked toward the centre, the white powder rose to the top of his polished boots. It was a moment of profound, frozen silence. Play was, quite obviously, impossible. But for the players, the sheer absurdity of the situation broke the tension. Clive Lloyd, the West Indian powerhouse who had smashed the ball into the neighbouring gardens on Saturday, looked at the white blanket with eyes wide in disbelief. In a spontaneous burst of childlike joy, he scooped up a handful of the freezing June snow and launched a snowball at Lancashire's Indian wicketkeeper, Farrokh Engineer. Within moments, two of the world's most professional teams were engaged in a snowball fight in the middle of a June cricket match, a scene so bizarre it felt like a hallucination. The absurdity didn't end at the boundary. Derbyshire's wicketkeeper Bob Taylor, along with teammates Jeff Miller and Keith Stevenson, wandered over to the adjacent bowling green. There, they watched a group of equally stubborn bowlers attempting to continue their game. It was a comedic struggle against nature. The heavy bowls acted like giant snowballs, picking up thick layers of white as they rolled, growing larger and slower until they came to a dead halt halfway down the lane. The sound of the game, the sharp crack of the bowls, was muffled by the deepening snow. Eventually, the realization set in. Summer had been completely usurped. The match at Buxton was officially called off, and the scoreboard, which usually displayed runs and wickets, now stood as a silent witness to a whiteout. The photographs from that day, images of white-clad cricketers standing in a white-covered field, would go on to grace the front pages of national newspapers, a testament to the day the British weather finally lost its mind. As the morning of June the 2nd wore on, it became clear that the whiteout at Buxton was not an isolated freak of nature, but the vanguard of a nationwide atmospheric coup. From the rugged peaks of the Cairngorms to the suburban sprawls of Greater London, Britain was being forcibly dragged back into the freezer. The psychological shock was perhaps more profound than the cold itself. Only 48 hours earlier, the nation had been basking in a heat wave that promised an endless summer. Now, that promise was buried under a shroud of white. In the East Midlands, sleet and heavy snow showers battered Birmingham, turning the Lickey Hills into a scene more reminiscent of a Victorian Christmas card than a June morning. The streets of Britain presented a surreal tableau of unpreparedness. Imagine the morning commute. Thousands of office workers stepped onto station platforms wearing light cotton shirts, sundresses and sandals, the uniform of a summer they thought had arrived. They stood shivering, their breath blooming in the frigid air, staring in disbelief as thick, wet flakes of snow settled on their shoulders. The central heating systems, which had been drained or switched off weeks ago, remained dormant in thousands of homes. Families huddled in living rooms, forced to dig into the back of cupboards for hot water bottles and woolen jumpers that had been packed away with mothballs for the season. Coal fires were lit in early June, their smoke rising into a sky that should have been filled with the golden light of the summer solstice. The infrastructure of the country, geared up for a summer of drought, simply buckled. Local councils had long since stood down their gritting crews. The salt bins were empty, and the snowplows were tucked away in the back of maintenance depots. In Scotland, the situation was even more dire. Across the Highlands, nearly 10 centimetres of snow settled on the ground, staying there for 4 agonising days. The main arterial roads between Edinburgh and Glasgow, usually buzzing with summer tourists, became treacherous ice rinks, forced to be cleared by gritting lorries that had to be recalled from their summer maintenance. For the natural world, the timing was catastrophic. Farmers in the northern reaches found themselves in a desperate battle to save newborn lambs, creatures born into the warmth of May only to be greeted by the lethal sting of a June blizzard. Spring crops, which had been thriving in the record-breaking sunshine of the previous weeks, were seared by the frost. Gardeners, who had spent their weekends meticulously planting out delicate bedding plants, tulips, roses, and geraniums, watched helplessly as their labour was crushed under the weight of the snow. It was a day when the British calendar seemed to have suffered a nervous breakdown, a moment in history where nature decided to remind a confident nation that it still held the ultimate power of surprise. By the morning of Wednesday, June the 4th, the Arctic nightmare that had paralysed Britain began to dissolve as quickly and as inexplicably as it had arrived. As if some celestial switch had been flipped once more, a warm front surged up from the southwest, bringing with it a flood of humid, balmy air from the Atlantic. Within 48 hours of throwing snowballs at the Buxton cricket ground, the residents of Derbyshire were watching the white shroud vanish, replaced by the steam of rapidly melting ice. The transition was so violent that it felt like recovering from a fever dream. Temperatures that had hovered near freezing on Monday began a relentless climb, soaring back into the high 20s. By the weekend, the jumpers and hot water bottles were shoved back into the darkness of the cupboards. And the nation returned to its deck chairs and barbecues, dazed and sunburnt once again. But the snow of June 1975 was not a mere curiosity. It was a meteorological warning shot. Philip Eden, one of Britain's most respected climatologists, would later describe it as the most outrageous thing that June has ever done to us. It remains the latest date in recorded history that snow has ever fallen on the English lowlands, a 250-year freak event that stands alongside the Great Storm of 1987 in the annals of impossible weather. What made it even more surreal was the context of the months that followed. The summer of 1975 didn't just return, it intensified. It became one of the warmest on record, with an average temperature of nearly 17 degrees Celsius, the hottest since the legendary summer of 1947. This paradoxical freeze in June acted as the gateway to the historic drought and the punishing, record-breaking heatwave of 1976. For those who were there, the memory is etched in a mixture of humour and awe. At Buxton, when play finally resumed on Tuesday, The pitch was a treacherous, rock-hard surface, hidden under a damp veneer. It was so unpredictable that the batsman Ashley Harvey Walker famously removed his false teeth and handed them to the umpire for safekeeping before taking his stance, terrified of a ball leaping off the frozen turf and into his face. Derbyshire collapsed twice that day, but nobody remembered the score. They remembered the snow. Exactly 1 week after the blizzard, a reporter returned to the same ground to find spectators in short sleeves, basking in 24-degree heat as if the whiteout had never happened. We tell the story of June 1975 because it reminds us of the fragility of our expectations. It is a reminder that the seasons are not a fixed contract, but a living, breathing, and sometimes temperamental force. 70 years of records were shattered in a single afternoon, teaching a confident nation that nature always holds the final card. To this day, the sight of a clear, blue June morning in Britain still carries a faint, ghostly echo of that Monday in 1975. A reminder that even in the heart of summer, winter is never truly dead. It is merely waiting for its moment to return.